So, Nick Ryan, thank you very much for joining us this morning for InConversation.
Pleasure to be here.
Can you start by telling me just a little bit about your upbringing?
Very normal, very ordinary, happy childhood.
Dublin, are you?
Yeah, I was born in Dublin. Moved around a little as a child. I think I was lived on the north side for the first 6 months of my life. Then moved kind of south side. Did a spell in Delgany when in my early years. I think when I was about 7 to 10, and then my parents moved back in to South County, like near Dunleary there, Cornelscourt. So lovely. Anyway, for anyone who's interested, always loved interested film, and as a kid, we used to we started making films on tape, if that makes any sense. We'd script these little ridiculous scenarios, and we'd record them and put on special effects. I used to collect special effects records, BBC special effects, sound effects records, and we used to do these ridiculously over-the-top, epic, disaster movie style radio pieces. And then we discovered the cine cameras that our folks had in the 70s, and started making film versions of these.
And when you say we, is that?
Oh, well, my cousin is, some people will know him as Robbie Ryan. He's a cinematographer, very good cinematographer now, and a group of friends of ours and Robbie and myself would get together in the summers and spend our summer days when we were kids now, making these little movies.
Okay. Have you still got them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. They're somewhere, yeah. I mean, and the thing is, we used to post-sync then, because Super 8 there was no sound on it. Or maybe there was, but we didn't have the capability of doing it. So we would, when we get the film back from the labs, and you'd also shoot in sequence, so you'd shoot cut to cut, because we didn't edit the films. We'd actually work out where we need to be, move to location, and then then we'd sit down and we'd do an audio track to it that we'd sync up and we'd play, and then we'd get everyone together, put up the big screen, press play, and watch it 10 times in a row and laugh ourselves silly at how stupid this was.
And what age were you?
Probably old enough to be doing something more practical. I was about 14, 15 years of age, you know what I mean? So kind of, around that time. Yeah, what about 85, 86? So it's and out of that then, we kind of really enjoyed doing that. So I got a video camera. I got a Canon High 8, not even, was it even High 8? Video 8 camera, I think in 1987. And then we started making, these kind of productions, which again, they carried on in that kind of scale. But it was just a great sense of fun in doing it. And but then I went to art college and to study. Am I jumping ahead too much there? Okay. I went to Dunleary, it's now IADT, I think, but it was Dunleary School of Art and Design back in 87. I did a foundation year, and as much as I wanted to always make films, I thought, in 1987, film wasn't it didn't look like you actually had a major career path. It's really hard, you don't think outside the country. You don't think, well, I'm just going to go away and I'm going to go to somewhere that, at that time, I remember thinking, I better do something that can kind of give me a career, if you will, and I studied design. But I always, film was always there. But I think design is a good discipline to study in conjunction with film, because, what you didn't get in practical in Dunleary, and Dunleary was a really good practical film course. Robbie ended up, I think Robbie's 2 years younger than me, but he did the film course there. And obviously had a lot of very good friends, and we worked on the films for the filmmakers as well in Dunleary as the designers, and worked on several films actually. But I studied design, went out into the world. I think in 91 I graduated, and I started working for a TV production, a small production company in Dunleary, mainly cutting out maps of Ireland and putting in singing priests behind them.
Okay.
Which didn't last very long. And I always, parallel to that, had an interest in computers and in terms of graphics, the computer capability on the short films we used to make. I bought a system called a Genlock, which would allow you. It sounds so easy now because everything's so accessible with computers, but back then it was almost impossible. A Genlock allowed you to superimpose graphics on top, so video graphics on top of moving pictures. So we could extend these epic films we were making with digital matte paintings. I mean, they look dreadful now, but there was a computer called an Amiga, a Commodore Amiga for the nerds out there who will remember this, and it even had some very rudimentary 3D applications, 3D programs. I just was fascinated in that whole world. I mean, it didn't in the late 80s that computer graphics didn't exist until Terminator, until The Abyss, until Jurassic Park came along. Computer graphics were never even entertained in the film industry. But I always thought it was an interesting area, so I kind of did a lot of that on the side. I trained myself up in the early 90s then in 3D Studio. I think it wasn't even Max, 3D software, and started doing a lot of animation work, and through that started directing animated commercials. And then
so was it kind of a natural easing from design into the film world, if you like? It was
well, for me, yeah. I mean, I don't know how much of this you want to use, but like, it's for me, it was for the early part of the 90s. I worked in a company called CBT Systems, and I was doing computer-based training products. So I was developing the visual look of their software, which became huge actually. And I was only there for a very short time, really 2 years. It seemed like a long time at the time. And at the time, I was always progressing with 3D animation and learning that, and still, doing a lot of photography and stuff, and even a bit of stuff on video. But editing wasn't accessible to you back then like the way it is now. You needed edit suites and so on and so forth to do stuff of real consequence and meaning. And then in around 95, I kind of joined a group of guys, and we set up a company called Image Now Films. And through that, I started directing commercials. I did a bit of that. Actually, one of the first things I ever did was live action elements. It was the title sequence for a program called the Classical World Series. And I shot out this Americana style baseball opening in Ardmore, on B stage in Ardmore, against a green screen. We'd sand, and then we built this whole American petrol station with computer graphics. And then I did identities for TG Cahir or Tina G as it was when it launched. I did all the opening idents that ran for many of those live action. But to direct commercials in Ireland in the 90s, you needed to be in in SIP2 in the union, and you needed to get sponsored by other directors. So I couldn't actually do live action commercials, or you'd have been breaking union regulations. And I suppose for a lot of the time in the 90s, I was kind of fine-tuning the craft of computer animation and learning a lot of that. But I got to a point where I felt I just wanted to, that love of being a filmmaker. You're still in your 20s, you know what I mean? You've still got, your life is mapped out in front of you. You think, you're never going to get old. And I think it was around, it was getting almost at the millennium, the turn of the millennium, when I kind of went, I want to make films. This is what I'm going to do. So I started pushing in towards music videos, and so I directed a couple of music videos for Bell X1.
Oh, right, okay.
Pinball Machine, and I think the second was Man on Mirror. First one I really enjoyed doing. The boys were great. The guys really wanted to, tell a story, and that to me, music videos then was a great way of telling stories, because you could create this just this tale that was set to the 3.5 minutes of music. Really enjoyed doing that. The wonderful Donal Gilligan shot that for me. I'm 16. I'm in Dollyman Strand, and I think in the basement of the the Morrison Hotel, actually, if I remember rightly. Anyway, so once I started doing music videos, then I started directing commercials, and then commercials. From there, started to, I got this. I worked with another filmmaker here in Dublin. He worked with me in Image Now, called Rory Robinson, and Rory and myself, we just always used to talk about film and wanted to make these kind of films. But the kind of films we wanted to make, nobody was really making. We couldn't really get a huge amount of support, even from the film board at that time.
And what kind of films were they?
They were not the kind of films that were being made. Ostensibly, I would say kind of more science fiction, or films that kind of alluded to something a little bit bigger, like they were like miniature versions of big feature films, but they were inherently grounded within story and but just pushing the boundaries a little bit. Other than I found a lot of short films to be a little dour and a little bit kind of introspective and a bit institutional abuse or suicide, and I just kind of went my grounding and my love of film has always been very, very commercial. I mean, I grew up loving Star Wars and E.T. and Blade Runner later maybe, but Back to the Future, very commercial bent in the approach to the films that I loved, and I think we all anyone who grew up in the 80s loved those films, even the Goonies and the Lost Boys and all of that kind of stuff. Some of them don't hold up as well now when you look back at them, but some of them do.
My dad would still sit down and watch the Goonies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love them. Yeah, but it's I did watch
it. We have a different tradition in Ireland. We come from a different perspective.
We do and we don't, and that's the thing. I mean, I think everyone has that. I mean, I think it's always level that we're much more literary and we're much more introspective, and do you want to take in our past as an example of of the stories we want to tell? And you know what? At the end of the day, I think you can twist yourself up in knots trying to define what is the stories you want to tell. At the end of the day, when you make films, it's whatever reaches out, whatever pushes through a page that reaches through you and says something to you. That's what you're going to make. Okay.
So then, your first short was. It wasn't the German. I've got the German.
No, it was A Lonely Sky. I made that. I produced a film for Rory called The Silent City, and we put that together in I think 2004. And then the following year, I kind of went, hang on, I want to do this for myself as well. So because Rory was directing that, so I wrote this. I think I've written it before, around that same time, in 2004. I sent it into the film board and it didn't. Again, I mean, I can understand on paper it sounded ridiculous anyway, because it was ostensibly a film which was about a pilot trying to break the sound barrier, and it had all these sequences of flying and rocket planes, and on I think of the shortcuts budget at the time, maybe 50 or 60 grand or something. They probably thought, well, how the hell are you going to do that? So whether they didn't like the story or they didn't think it was feasible to do, so I out of the background of that, I've been working with Seamus Byrne of Zenita Films as well. He worked as a producer for me, with me in Image Now. So when I do the commercials, I don't know if you know Seamus at all. Seamus is great. I've been working with Seamus for many, many years, and we put together got a budget, got a little bit of money together from the company, and we made A Lonely Sky. We just went out to Ardmore, shot for 3 days. I'd written the part very much in mind. I had this older guy, and I saw one day on the Sunday Times cover that Keir Delay, who I'd been a huge fan of. I'm a huge fan of 2001, Stanley Kubrick's 2001, and Keir had played Dave Bowman, the astronaut in 2001, and in my mind, probably this sounds absolute bullshit, but in my mind when I was writing it, I always saw it been very like an older Dave Bowman, and when I saw Keir, I went, that looks like Dave Bowman, and I went, that's Keir Delay, look at that. So I got in contact. He was over here in Ireland. He was doing a play for the Red Kettle Theatre Company, and I sent him an email and a script, and I said, hey, look, if you're amenable, I'd love to make this film. We can put it together very quickly. And he responded. He loved it, and came up and we did it. Okay. And so that was the beginning of that film, and there was about 6 months of visual effects work on that then, which I that's where my background came in handy with the 3D. Built the airplanes, built the environments, did the animation, did all the compositing, all the, it's a great skill to have as a director, to be able to fall back on, to be able to complete that movie.
Okay. So then, jumping forward to the summit, how did you get involved with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, whatever about Lonely Sky, I think that I did another film after called The German, which is in my opinion, a much better film. Again, that was supported by the Irish Film Board I'd written a very simple script, which was a duel between two people,
Okay.
and again, it did have a lot of. It's got 4.5-5 minutes of visual effects at the top. The opening of that sequence of the film is an aerial sequence. But I had managed to convince the film board at the meeting, because the only at the meeting, I think it was Andrew Meehan who was on the board at the time, on the panel, and he kind of went, "We love this story, but how are you going to do that opening thing?" And I explained, look, and I showed him that it was great to have had A Lonely Sky in the back. I said, "Well, see, all none of that's real. I will do that, and the budget for doing that will be zero, because
You can do it.
because I can do it." Yeah.
So is there kind of a reticence in terms of special effects from the Irish Film Board, or are we kind of afraid of?
At the time, maybe, yeah, because I mean, there was a group of us kind of doing films that were like James Mather and Stephen St. Ledger had made a film called Pray Alone, I think in 2004, which again had a huge amount of visual effects. That was maybe the first one of those to be finished, and was hugely ambitious. Then Rory did Silent City, and we got some completion funding for that. And then when I did A Lonely Sky, they gave me the German. So there was a lot more people pushing in towards doing visual effects in films. I think the danger with that then is that, obviously it makes the if you don't have the budget to do it, you're relying on favours if you can't do it yourself. So you're pulling people in to do it, and it's a very difficult thing to ask somebody, because it's very time intensive work, and you've got to lead by example. Sometimes some of these films don't get finished on time, and it probably frustrates the system a little. But you'd have to speak to the film board about that more than me. But the summit came about because I literally had just finished the German. It was kind of I think the German played first at the Cork Film Festival in 2008, and I got a great response to it. I got signed to what was ICM, the Independent in the UK, and then UTA in LA, who are the UTA are one of the largest talent agencies. Like, they represent the Coen Brothers and Johnny Depp and Harrison Ford, and it's wonderful. You think, hey, yeah. This is and at that point I was thinking, well, this is great. This is, I'm going to go try and make a feature film of at whatever level. So you go and you do a lot of meetings, but in August of 2008, the events that are portrayed in the summit happened, and I remember them at the time. I remember hearing the news stories. I remember genuinely not even knowing where K2 was. I always thought K2 was that mountain that's a trick question in pub quizzes, which is, what's the tallest mountain in the world? And it's not Everest, because there's a mountain in Hawaii. I can't even think what the real name of it is now. That is half submerged, so it's
right. Okay, so it's
yeah. So I always thought. So anyway, I always thought that was K2. I didn't know where K2 was. I didn't know it was the second tallest mountain in the world. I didn't know how difficult it was. But I remember hearing the stories about Ger McDonnell, and it was that he'd successfully summited, and everyone was delighted. And then the next day it was like, oh, there was been a big accident, and that some of the climbers were stranded. People didn't know where they were. And then the third day was like, certain people had been thinking, but Ger was missing and presumed dead. And I was terribly, terribly sad. But it was just a story I'd heard. And then a couple of weeks, maybe 6 or 8 weeks later, as things this is how things happen in Ireland. Darrell Kavanagh, who works with me in Image Now, he was at a stag in the west of Ireland, and he met a guy called Stephen O'Reilly, who was a friend of Ger's, who had been to the South Pole with Ger in 2006, I believe. And he told him about the story, and he said, "Oh, I heard there was other things that happened on the mountain." And Darrell came into it on the Monday or the Tuesday, whatever, and told me this. And I went, okay, that sounds interesting. But at the time, again, I didn't know anything about mountains. I hadn't really made any major documentaries. I'd made a couple of documentaries about the Electric Picnic that had screened here, actually, in the IFI and stuff. I did 2 or 3 of them. But they were light and fluffy and heavily music-focused, Yeah. And so I was going, well, what do I know about this? And then Stephen knew that there was a climber who climbed on Everest with Ger in 2003 called Pat Falvey, and he brought Pat up to talk to us, and Pat kind of explained the whole thing about mountains and put it all in a very good context. I mean, I thought, that's really exciting, but the one thing that stood out to me more than anything else was how bloody ludicrous this was. Why on earth would anybody put themselves in such danger I think the statistic had been leveled at that point that for every 4 people who'd stood on the top of the mountain, that 1 had died trying to get there. And I went, that's worse than Russian roulette. Why would anybody do that? So, I'm inherently seem to be drawn to stories about people doing extreme things. So I've subsequently learned that, I think. But it's that reached out to me, as I said to you earlier on. Some things sometimes reach out to you. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, I don't know what this is about really, or what approach to take to it. But very quickly, we set up interviews with one of the survivors, a Dutch climber called Wilco van Rooyen. And we went to Holland and we interviewed him, and he was angry. I remember in the interview thinking he was looking for answers as much as we were looking for answers to the questions that we had. And really not being a climber, I didn't have the massive technical aspect of understanding, but I wanted to understand the emotional aspects of what it was like to be on the mountain, why he did that, why couldn't they find their way down? I mean, why can't you just go in the big footprint you left on the way up? Yeah. And he's like, it's not that simple, and he'd get angry because, who's this non-climber asking him questions? Am I judging him? No, you know what I mean. But like to him, he was very direct. English isn't his first language either, so difficult. But I thought it was fascinating. I remember coming back from that, thinking like, wow, that's really interesting, and I felt really amazed at the hardship that they'd gone through and why they would put themselves through that. And then that was in October. It was only a matter of 6 or 8 weeks after the actual accident. Wilco subsequently lost all his toes. He still had them at the time, heavily bandaged, when we did that interview. And then we brought Pemba Gelji Sherpa, who was key to this whole story in the summit. We brought him from Kathmandu to Ireland, and we went down to Kerry. And Pat had worked with, obviously had climbed with Pemba in 2003, so he had that connection to Pemba. So Pemba came in, and we spent a day going through the team photographs on a big screen with a pointer, trying to understand the geography of the mountain. I mean, it seems, I see it in my head now. I can't close my eyes without seeing it. But like at the time, trying to understand the routes and why people would go, why don't you go that way? And Pemba went through everything. And then when we did the interview, what was interesting was, even though Pemba and Ger and Wilco had climbed on the same team on the same day on the same mountain that morning, Pemba's stories, at a point diverged from what Wilco had to say about the mountain.
In what way?
It was contradictory in that, like, Wilco would have said things like, when the first climber fell, we everyone talked about it, and we had a discussion, and we decided what should we do. And he said, and we'd asked Pemba, and Pemba said, yeah, we still have time, you can make the summit, we should continue. Whereas Pemba will clearly say, when the first climber fell, everybody stayed silent, nobody communicated with each other, and he felt psychologically unwell and that he didn't want to keep climbing.
Okay. Now,
I'm not saying he didn't say that, I'm not with the Wilco's line, that he didn't say, you will have time to reach the summit, but I think you've got a Dutch person speaking English to a Nepalese person speaking English. So communication, the only person who could actually speak English perfectly on the mountain that day as his first language was Ger MacDonald. But so that to me was interesting. And the reality there is that, like, what Pemba said is, that, like, obviously, yeah, you can continue. And I asked, but, like, I mean, the one thing I always was like, well, why did you continue if you felt he's very spiritual. He felt the mountain had spoken and had taken a life. He didn't know the second life was going to go. Like, they weren't aware of the second person to die.
Somebody died before Ger, yes.
Oh yeah, Ger was one of the last people to die on the mountain. On the way up, yeah, a Serbian climber fell, and his team went down. So everyone kind of went, well, this team went down. There's nothing we can do. He stood up. They all thought he was okay, but he'd actually had a major head trauma. He stood up and fell over and was dead. And then subsequently, a high-altitude porter, a Pakistani high-altitude porter, slipped while bringing that body down the mountain, and he slipped to his death. Now, the people above that weren't aware of the second death, and as they continued to the summit. But that's jumping too far ahead. At that point, then I really realised, okay, now this is interesting, because there is a completely different opinion as to why they continued and what they should do. And I went, I'm interested in the story, and then it became to me something that I had to tell.
So was that your starting point? Because, when you do a drama, the narrative kind of gives you a direction. But
it's the complete opposite.
Yeah.
See, documentaries, it's almost the complete opposite of film. As is not always the case, your script is your blueprint, and that's you follow that blueprint. Like, so you write a brilliant script, and then you go make it. Okay? It never gets changed. It never gets rewritten. Yeah, that never happens, does it? But at least you know where you're going. You know the points
of where you need to get to.
Exactly. With a documentary, it is the great unknown, because although I have to say quite early on, and I suppose one of the most important aspects, and again at that point, when I interviewed Wilco, and then when we went to interview Pemba, it wasn't about Jerry MacDonald. I mean, the ironic thing is everyone thinks, I ended up making this film because of about Jerry MacDonald, because he was an Irishman. It's an Irishman making a film about an Irish climber. That was not the case at all. We just thought that Jerry at that time had been another unfortunate casualty, that he just didn't make it down the mountain. But what Pemba told us about the radio, I mean, it's really complex to explain. That's why you should see the film, and hopefully I don't know if we even explain it that clearly in the film, to be quite honest, because it's such a complex series of events. But when Pemba explained to us what had happened, there was that light bulb moment of, holy shit, Ger had done something really extraordinary on the mountain, and nobody knows about this. And even to the point that when I was doing interviews, I think the last of the interviews we did were almost 2 years later. I mean, the interviews with Pemba and Wilco were in 2008, remember? The last interviews I did were just before we did the recreations in 2011, in January 2011. So what's that, 2 and a bit years later? When I spoke to Frederick Strang and I told them about what Jerry did, they went, "No, he couldn't have done that." No, and I went, "But I showed them photographic proof." People who were there weren't even aware of what had happened on that mountain, and that's, to me, the fascinating aspect. And subsequently, I would learn from first-hand experience, part and parcel, why that was the case. Because you cannot factor in. It's one thing for us, you and me, to have a conversation here at sea level, but to be in the ground that they're standing on, above 8,000 meters, believe me, nothing makes sense. It's a nightmare world. And I Stephen O'Reilly and myself, subsequently in July of 2011, went to Pakistan to film the mountain. And I think I flew to. I was filming in the filming helicopter without oxygen, which I did have, but I didn't use it because I was busy. To 25,500 feet, which is 7,600 meters, which is just stupid. So I know what I mean. I got really hypoxic, so I felt firsthand the effects. So it's not quite the same as because they would have acclimatized, but it's debilitating.
Doesn't quite apply in that.
No, it doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't. Not, a lot of things make sense. It's not a place to be making decisions. Mm-hmm. It really isn't.
There were, as you've explained, there were a massive amount of questions as to the exact circumstances as to Ger died.
Yeah.
Was that a weight on you? Did you feel you needed to answer those questions? Was that?
Well, to a point, yeah, because I felt like what he had done was extraordinary. Mm-hmm. Because I'm not a climber, so I felt he was the person that everybody would like to think that they are. Yeah. To me, he was the moral center of this story. He did what we all think we would do in that situation, but the reality has shown that is not the case necessarily. And that is not to criticize. I don't criticize anyone else for doing what they did on the mountain to survive that day. I don't think anybody willfully walked over anybody and left anybody behind. Marco came under a lot of criticism at the time because he kept changing his story, not because of what he did. He stopped with Ger for 3 hours that morning and did everything in his powers, along with Ger MacDonald, to try and rescue those 3 climbers that were stricken there, trapped in the ropes. And he was exhausted. They'd spent a night in the open above 8,000 meters. It was a miracle that they survived that night alone, let alone try and enact a rescue on the side of a mountain, which is almost impossible. But something in Ger said, like they were descending and Ger stopped, and he'd gone down a little bit, and Ger stopped and went back up, and that's the last anyone ever saw him alive. And the reality is, I have a photograph of one of those people who were trapped, which means somebody freed, at least that one person. And that is the basis of everything that you have. And that was one of the things that through someone like Frederick Strang, who, when I told him the story after the interview, he kind of went, well, that didn't happen. Jared couldn't have rescued anybody. They all died on the mountain. I said, but what about the photograph? And he goes, what photograph? And I says, oh, you haven't seen that photograph? And I took out the picture, it's in the film. It's a gruesome image, and it was a decision I had to make to show it in the film because it's part of the evidence. And if you just say it exists but don't show it, it's conspiracy theory bullshit. So the photograph is 100% identified by their costume was Jim McBote and Pasang Bote. And Jim McBote was one of the climbers who had been trapped. So he couldn't have got there unless he had walked the 200 meters to the point of the avalanche that eventually took his life and took Jer's life. And when I showed that picture to Frederick, he went, how on earth is that possible? Where did you get that picture? And I said, Pemba took that picture after the avalanche. And he was just gobsmacked. And he went, I had no idea. And it changed his whole thinking. And he'd written a book about this. So, 7 books have been written about it. And the thing is, it's when you get those moments when you can look somebody in the eye who had been there. And I'm not to turn around and say, that's not what happened, you were there, and I'm telling you how it happened. But for him, it changed his opinion instantly about what had happened on the mountain. And then you're right. Then you're not just, it's not, even if Jer hadn't freed any of those climbers, what he did was heroic on the mountain that day. And I try and explain that to the family, and I think they understand that themselves. We can't even begin to understand what it must be like to lose a son and to never have their body. Do you know what I mean? And we can couch it in every kind of language we possibly think we can talk about and say, but at least he did something. And they know he died doing what he would never have lived with himself if he didn't do everything that he could do properly. But that's no comfort, really. I think it's what somebody says to it. I've said to them many times, I don't believe Jer should have been on an 8,000 metre peak if he wasn't prepared to just keep walking. And I'll probably get criticism from the climbing community for that. And people always latch onto that kind of soundbite, which is that there's an unwritten code of the mountain that, if you come across somebody, you have to leave them there. You leave them to die. You don't leave them to die. You do everything in your powers to be able to do it. But it's easier to probably turn around and say the unwritten code is that, everybody who subscribes to climbing an 8,000 metre peak knows that in their heart of hearts, that if something happens above 8,000 metres, you can only rely on yourself. And that's the basis of that. It doesn't mean that people don't help each other. That's not true. It's just been perpetuated a bit by the whole Everest story of people walking over fallen bodies. And lest I sound like a liar, but I think as we were going into shooting on the mountain that year, I remember reading a story on one of the websites about people on Everest that season, walking. There was a doctor, a girl, who had tweeted, she'd seen people who were lying down on the way up to the summit, and then she and she tweeted on the way back down, that guy that we saw collapsed on the way up, he's dead now. And I'm going, but you continued past somebody who had fallen, in line there to get to the summit. For many people, this is their only chance to do this. They spent $60,000 to get their permits to climb that mountain. It's a circus, Everest. But, it bore itself out this year, I guess, with the whole thing that happened. But you know what I mean? K2 isn't like that. It's not a mountain with commercial climbers as such. It's not amateur climbers. You really want to be a pretty serious climber to climb that mountain in the first place.
And having been there, because that comes across really strongly in the film, that there is a compulsion to climb it despite its dangers, and a necessary ruthlessness in a way to survive, in some sense. Having been to that environment, can you understand the pull of it? It's hard to fathom from here.
Absolutely. Here's the thing. Let's face it. I took what would be the easiest way in. I flew in via helicopter from Skardu, so I didn't do the 10-day. Just to get into K2, it's a 10-day walk in. Okay, it's just crazy, and the hardships. They spend up to 6 weeks acclimatizing, going up and down the mountain, fixing ropes. No matter what, I don't think I'd ever have the lure to. I think I like my comforts too much to ever put myself through the hardships of that. But at the same time, there's an obsessive draw. And a huge part of what the summit is obsession, and it's one of my favorite themes in film. And this may sound like bullshit, but like I found myself waiting in Scardu every day, watching the weather, looking at the parameters. My parameters for that situation, for us there, it was Stephen O'Reilly, myself, and Mike Wright, the engineer who owned the Cineflex, and our fixer, Nissar Malak. And we had to, it was a constant battle to kind of get the military to give us the time to fly mixed with the good weather. And we had a very short period of time because I had no money to do it properly. The BBC had tried to do it 4 years earlier and spent 400,000 and still never managed to film K2. I had a tenth of that there. So we had one shot and one shot only, and we took a risk the morning we went, and it was perfect. I mean, the euphoria at that was amazing. But the level of obsession, I ironically found myself emailing Wilco asking his weather guys, the same guys he had got weather maps for the mountain, to give me the weather maps for the mountain. And I thought, this is like life imitating art, because I was becoming like Wilco. I mean, I may have alienated everyone. One by one, I pissed everybody else off with that single-minded version of, we're not going until we get this mountain. We're here to do this. And I probably didn't thank them enough for their. There was just endless waiting. When I say endless, we were there for 10 days. We were lucky. I in my mind thought that, I may be gone for 4 weeks. It's kind of like an ancient expedition to Africa. Like, what I mean? I may be gone sometime. But we couldn't afford much more than 10 days, and that equipment I had. If you were paying a day rate, it would have been the budget of the movie. And I probably didn't thank them enough at the time for their support and their patience with me. But I just had to film the mountain. I felt, we can't make this film without seeing the mountain. And, there was 3 years of research, and I needed to see the mountain myself. I felt that it wouldn't be complete until I saw it. That's that may come. I'm just saying absolute bullshit, but it's absolutely true.
But, I mean,
I'd put it in context.
Yeah,
for me.
You need to have a connection with it yourself.
And as beautiful as it looks on those shots, I can't begin. I only looked at it with my own eyes once because it was so intensely bright. Because I was filming on screen, so to look away and then look at the screens would take my eyes about a minute and a half to readjust to the screen, and it was too important. The time, every second counted there. So I only looked out the window once, and it was so blinding. But the scale of the mountain, your heart just jumps. You go, it's breathtaking.
And it's wonderful because we kind of live in a world where, we're going to Mars. There are very few things that inspire that. Oh my goodness, it is great.
No, it is.
Yeah,
it is, and it probably, to answer the question you asked, it put in my mind the reason why people go there, because obviously the people who go there have a very alpha driven approach to their lives, and it's very competitive, and it's all about them getting up the mountain, and very singular. Mountaineering is a group. It is a group activity. It's very difficult to do that. I don't think you could do that mountain on your own. I don't think it's possible. But I understand why they go. There's a camaraderie in the base camp. There's got to be days where everybody hates each other. There's endless days of waiting out weather. But the beauty of that scenery, and the fact that so few people on this earth. I mean, all of our sites, they're tourist attractions now, and people wheeled in. Even Everest,
they're accessible in a way that
you can go to. You can do Everest. You can do probably base camp treks to K2, but it's much more difficult because of where it is. It's Pakistan. It's not exactly the most unhostile country on the planet at the moment, and the other side is China. So at least Everest has that. I mean, that way in for people to see it. But I'm not saying the walk into Everest is any more beautiful, but like the Karakoram is astonishing. It's just words do fail you when you just look at it. You just kind of got, you just kept going, oh my God, every time you'd look at that, you just see these incredible sights. I'm doing a terrible job describing what kind of director am I.
You're not, and I've kind of veered off point, but
no worries.
You alluded to it there. I was just curious as to the practicalities of, who do you seek permission from to film on K2, or the actual practicalities of going there? What?
All right. Well, the reconstructions weren't filmed on K2; they were filmed elsewhere.
Yes, they were filmed in the Swiss Alps.
In the Swiss Alps, exactly. But to go to K2, I think the process of doing that started about a year before going. Ended up going in July of 2011. I made my first investigations in April of 2010.
Okay.
And I'd written to Askari Aviation, who were the civilian wing, if you can call that, of the Pakistan military. You have to remember, in Pakistan there is no civilian aviation. There's no private aviation like the way we have here or in the UK or America. You just can't fly a private plane or a helicopter there. So you have to use the military in some shape or form. I mean, it's a very martial country, Pakistan. And that involves sending visas to get ISI clearance and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, it was back and forth. I agreed kind of figures and fees, how many hours we need. You need to fly 2 helicopters, the logistics of it. And then one day I cottoned on to this thing. I watched Planet Earth, and I looked at the snow leopard sequences, and there was a little bit about the Karakoram, and I looked at the end credits, and I saw at the end, you know, Pakistan sequences. You know, the guy was Walkabout Films. It was a guy called Nisar Malik. So I sent him an email and I went, "Hi, my name's Nick Ryan. I'm making this movie about K2, about blah blah." I explained it all. I've got no money, but I've been in contact with Askari Aviation, and he sent me an email straight back with his phone number, and I rang him. I was in Cork at the time, and I remember speaking to him, and he was really 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 great guy, and he was just like, "Look, you can't afford me, but you know your project sounds great. I'll do everything I can to help you." So I went, "Well, thank you." So he started liaising on my behalf. He's Pakistani native, lives in France and England, has done a lot of stuff with the BBC, which is good because we were part of the BBC partially. And he was brilliant, and he kind of started getting the thing again. We had resupplied all of our visas, and then Stephen was coming. And then when I was originally going to film with the guy who had done some work for me on the German, Adrian Warren, he directed a lot of the Planet Earth, or no, Life on Earth series with David Attenborough. Amazing guy, but he unfortunately had cancer, and he up until the last day he literally one of his last days he was applying for visas to go to K2 with me, and he died. And so that didn't work out. But I got in contact with Mike Wright then, who was a really really gentleman, whose normal work with the Cineplex is filming like in Dubai at the Grand Prix and stuff. So I told him, like, fancy coming to K2, and he went, "What the hell? Are they going to put a film on?" So I managed to convince him to come. So he needed to get clearance, and we were constantly getting clearances, or trying to get clearances. And then at the end of May, they killed Bin Laden, and I just went. I think I may have been the only person who went, "Fuck, why did I do that?" Because they'd found him in Abbottabad, like 60 miles north of Islamabad, and I thought, well, that's just gone and probably screwed everything up here, you know. So because we flew into Islamabad 6 weeks after that, and drove right through Abbottabad. Westerners were very not that some weren't working, but we were told, do not get out of the cars, do not move the thing. Here's shameless promotion on the DVD. There's a making of that whole section, and you'll see we drove over the Babusar Pass, where there was a Taliban came up on the van, and we were all standing, and Stephen was filming, so we have it on camera, and we all just stood there kind of going, "Oh shit," you know, and they waved, and we just got back in our vehicles and drove off, and it was like possibly one of the most heart and mouth feelings I've ever had, because it's a 25 hour drive to get to the town that you get to, because we couldn't fly. But the logistics were really difficult. But like once on the ground, we were great. But we had to go and ask the, we brought this equipment, and we had to ask the military if we could drill holes in our helicopters to mount it, and eventually they wouldn't let us, which allowed us to. We had to put the camera at the side, which meant flying with the door open, which really made no difference because helicopters aren't pressurized anyway, and. I'd done all the research as much as I could. I knew helicopters could only get to 6,000, maybe 6,500 meters at the most. That's their technical ceiling, I think. And so I briefed the pilots where I wanted to go when we get in there, where we'd need to be to see. I looked at 3D versions. I built a 3D version of the mountain to know what I'd see from what angle. And I said I wanted to get the bottleneck area and the Serac and as much of that. And so I storyboarded it and showed it to the pilots, And on the day, that morning when we flew in, they just flew out. We refueled at a place called Paiju, which is it's the kind of halfway. It's about a 4-day walk in, if you were walking in. And we refueled, took off. Weather was beautiful, so we said, let's go as high as possible. So went straight up. And it was only when I was looking directly at the bottleneck area, and I could see the bottleneck couloir, which I'd spent 3 years looking at in photographs and video footage taken on the day. And I'm going like, that's not possible. And I went like, how can I see this? And I looked at it, and that's when I looked out the window. I was right parallel with it, a little bit lower, but and we were at 700, and that's at 8,000 meters, And I asked the pilot, I said, how high are we? And he went, he didn't. They don't use meters. He said 25,500 feet. And I'm going like, that's not possible. That's 1,000 meters higher than the helicopters are actually meant to fly, which got them into severe trouble. But they pushed it. They knew what I wanted to do, and they were so compliant, and they're brilliant pilots. But it was possibly very dangerous because you're straining the engine. There's oxygen is so thin. It's taking every ounce of power just to keep the helicopter moving. You can't stop. You have to keep moving, because if you stop, you're just going to drop out of the sky. But you know what? You're euphoric because you're not taking enough oxygen. You're euphoric because you're seeing the mountain. You're euphoric because you're getting the shots. You're also sitting there aware that you're looking at a gravesite like that. Yeah. Somewhere on this mountain is Jerry McDonald. And somewhere in this mountain are the other climbers who died and will remain there forever. And all of these things are running through your brain, and it's like a dream. It's like it happens in an instant, and you're just looking at this place, and but it's beautiful. Mm-hmm. And we had planned 3 missions, and we had to go back and refuel to this little staging point on the second one. The second helicopter, you have a support helicopter that has to fly alongside when you're over ice, for the very reason what happened in the next one. I was in the first helicopter with the camera again for the second flight, very low, and the pilot turned around and said, we've lost the other helicopter, we have to turn back. And I went, what do you mean? He said, well, we've lost communication, they had an engine problem. So we went, it now became a search and rescue mission, and we flew back, and thankfully all the way along there's these little places to land, because it's a glacier. When you're up high it just looks like a gravel road, but when you're down close it's 60 foot, 30, it's just like there's nowhere to land. It's like the surface of the moon. It really is. It's an alien world. And they'd found one of these little staging points all the way up, and they'd come down. Subsequently found out that because they refueled out of barrels, there was sediment in the barrel, blocked the fuel filter, cut the engine, and they had to look. They had seconds. I'm not just. This isn't a fake documentary made up thing. They had and because Mike, he was a Royal Navy engineer, mm-hmm. the camera guy. He was in the Royal Navy as a helicopter engineer. He's a pilot. He looked at the engine, saw the engine lights out, looked, and he looked out the windows and went, "We're fucked. That's it. We're not getting out of this." And he said they were just great pilots. They just straight into action. They saw that thing. They came in hard, no damage though. And it took about 2 hours to fix the engine. At which point I got hypoxia, and Stephen did the third flight and got some amazing footage. And I just wanted to get off that mountain, because I was at 5,000 meters with my head starting to swell, and I was just going I feel really sick. And you start to panic then, and then we got down to Scardoon by the time we got there, which is at 2,000 meters. Okay. And I felt great. All I had was a bit of a headache, but I felt back to normal again. But we were just, and then it's like, and that's it, And then it was like 24 hours driving all the way back to Iceland.
As you describe it, the investment, the personal investment in it, it is slightly akin to what those mountaineers are driven by themselves. Is that overstating?
You know what? The thing, if you do look at it, when I think about it now, what we did was ridiculously risky. Mm-hmm. Almost, I think that the odds, were actually even slightly worse than the statistics are going to demand. Insurance was the problem on that as well when we did that. But for many reasons, for reasons of, I actually think the drive from Islamabad to Skardu was more dangerous than the helicopter flight, because you're on the Karakoram highway. It's like literally 1,000-foot drops at some points, and you're on it's like a donkey path. I'm not exactly, anyone will say it's one of the most dangerous, unstable roads, because it's constantly landslides, and the road just disappears underneath you. So it's part and parcel of it. But without sounding egotistical or alpha about it, at the time you're just driven by the need and the desire to get, and that's what I was saying earlier on. I probably pissed every one of those at one point, every single one of them off by the drive to actually get what you needed to do. But you're there for a job. You're there to do something. And I wanted to see it, and the obsession was there to see it. Like, I knew at that point then, and when I started the film in 2008, like in 2009 in the beginning, when I kind of went, this is really going to happen, we're really going to make this, and raise the fine. It took 2 years to do that. But when I decided that, I never really thought I would ever go to K2. I remember thinking, this is just not, it's a step too far, and it's never going to be, I don't need to, I have enough footage, or I will have enough footage. But it became apparent when I was filming the reconstructions that this film could not be complete without, even for me personally as a director, having experienced it.
And was that more of an emotional thing as opposed to a practical decision?
It very much was an emotional thing, but there was the background of it was practical. It was, you can justify emotional responses by putting a practical reason on something. It was like, well, we have to do it that way, and you know what? Practically, I'm so glad it is, because it's one of the talking points. It's one of the things I think that people see, because it's been filmed like it's never been filmed before, and it'll be very difficult for anyone ever to do that again. So,
were you always going to do the reconstructions?
I think the drama director in me probably thought so. I'm really trying to remember at the time, did I actually think that was going to be the case in the beginning? I think as soon as we started hearing the stories, and I knew that like a lot of what happened in the film happened at night time, I knew that it took a long time before I was ever allowed access to archive footage. The MacDonald family didn't want to have any involvement, didn't want to know me, didn't want to talk to me for at least 1.5 years, 2 years. It took a long time of talking to them. So I didn't have access to Ger's footage. But I also knew, by the way, Ger didn't have his camera on the day of the climb. So I didn't know what was on that. I knew Wilco had footage, but he was making a documentary, so he wasn't making his footage accessible to me. Okay. I knew Fredrik Strang, the Swedish climber, had footage, and he did send it to me eventually. And I looked at it, but he didn't get to the summit. So I kind of went, in my head, they were going to be too busy surviving, so they weren't really going to be doing what we see in the Blair Witch Project, turning a camera on themselves with the snotty nose going, we're not going to make it. They literally were busy surviving, and taking photographs and snapshots was the last thing on their mind. And there really isn't anything from the summit forward. There's nothing. I mean, there's stuff taken from Camp 4 the morning after the summit, but there's really very, very little. Thankfully, there was people in base camp filming, the rescue operations in action. So there was an inherent drama in that. But again, I didn't know what was on that footage. But how do we tell this story? And I just knew that there were going to be tracks of this that were going to be at night time. And then Mark Monroe, who wrote the film with me, he was very aware that, well, how do we get off the mountain? And that's why we had the Walter Benatti story from a claustrophobic aspect. But the reconstructions, I felt the only way of really doing the film justice was reconstructions. Now, for some people, reconstructions are a really, really dirty word, but I couldn't care less in that respect, because this is such a complex story. It got so many narrative strands, and it was already going to be so many voices, that I figured whatever keeps an audience engaged in the story and keeps you focused on what's happening is the best way of telling the story. So from that point forward, when I realized how complex it was going to be, we decided, yes, we'll look at the key scenes that need to be reconstructed, that will actually show the reasons as to why things happened, and use that to tell the story.
Okay. You've mentioned it there, you've alluded to it. Speaking to the family, was that as difficult as the actual physicals? Ger he was only very recently dead when you started all of this.
Yeah, I think we went down and talked to him, to Ger's mum Gertie and the family by the Christmas of 2008, and to say, look, we're going to make this film, and it was just to let them know that we were going to be doing something on this, and we were going to be talking to Pam, we were talking to Wilco, and, it was with the purpose of would they be interested in contributing, because at that point, again, as I say, we'd interviewed Pemba, and I knew what Ger had done on the mountain, and part and parcel was trying to get that. They talked to Pemba, so they were aware of what had happened as well, you see. So they wanted to get the truth out there as well, but I don't think they felt maybe that this was going to be the method of doing it at the time. You'd have to speak to them about that, I guess. But subsequently, I mean, it took a long time. But when they eventually did, kind of, I would explain what I was trying to do and how I was going to try and make the film and how we were going to do it. But I have to be very clear: they had absolutely no editorial control. They never saw anything in work in progress cuts. But they agreed to be interviewed. I interviewed Gertie, which is Jer's mum, along. It was a group interview with his sisters, and they all sat and did that. But there was too many voices in the film, so we didn't put them in the end. So Jer's kind of represented on screen by his brother JJ, and Damien, who's married to Denise, who's Jer's sister, is his brother-in-law. Because Damien was really the spearhead for trying to get the truth out there and finding what had happened. So I think his voice was an interesting one in the film. But I'll be very, very clear that they had absolutely no, if I turned around and said that Jared done something, I mean, that would be what would have to have gone in, But, it was, all those interviews were difficult. Mm-hmm. Every single one of them. I mean, talking to his mom and his sisters about it. JJ was a 5-hour long interview, and it was just so emotional. I mean, I think we were all in tears. I'm not just saying that. At the end, I mean, he told a story at the end, which we just didn't put in the film. In the end, it's just, if I tell you now, I'd just start crying again. So I'm not going to do it. But but they were all difficult. I mean, Cecilia was an incredibly. I mean, we were all in tears at the end of that one as well. Stephen and Dumnock, who was the sound man on that one in Sweden. But I thought Cecilia would never talk. I mean, I'd interviewed the family before all that, and Cecilia was the last person I interviewed because she'd taken a lot of. She'd called me many times to talk over it. Well, what is it going to be about, and how are we going to do it? I've never talked about this. I don't know sure if I want to go back there. I mean, she saw her husband die in front of her eyes. So. But she was brilliant and amazing. So, but they were all difficult. I mean, the hardest part of making this film was the interviews. I mean, the rest of making the film is pretty much a technical exercise,
Yes. And then working with Pemba.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Sure, yeah.
How important?
Well, Pemba was so central to the story, and he became my technical advisor for the reconstructions, which was, I think, really important. There was Pemba cheering Dorje, cheering Sherpa, cheering Lama Sherpa, and Pasang Lama Sherpa. All 4 of them had been on K2 that day. 3 of them had been on the summit. Pemba cheering Lama Pasang Lama and cheering Dorje. You forget all those names. And cheering Lama's brother and cousin were the 2 people in that photograph that came down the mountain. And but Pemba is a brilliant climber. He's a very technically proficient climber, and his memory of the events was very clear and fantastic. And he's a voice that that to me was central to the story. And it made filming in the Alps difficult because they're Sherpa, they're not filmmakers, and filmmaking isn't a linear process. It's not like climbing the mountain. You don't go from one point to the next, and you're moving a camera here and you're matching angles. And I was using green screen on the mountains because the mountains in the background, as beautiful as the Alps were, do we have to get out of here?
No.
As beautiful as the Alps were, they don't look a bit like the Karakoram, and I felt that if these reconstructions were going to work properly, they weren't going to be like those where there's clearly a taller mountain in the background, So I took a lot of photographs, and I had photographs from the climbers that were going to become the background images for those reconstructions, much to the frustration of Robbie Ryan, by the way. He said, "What's wrong with those mountains?" But Pemba, we'd set something up, and he'd go, "No, when the Serbian climber fell, Jared was here and Marco was here," and it was just amazing to have that. And you have to be utterly respectful of the fact that these people had lived through this once before, and here we were. And film sets can be fairly irreverent places at the best times, and you can't have 16, 18 days on a mountain and not have some form of levity, some kind of lightness, and it's hard though, But they were amazing, and they adapted, and they learned very, very quick. The first couple of days, every shot almost took maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes of explanation. You probably get that I'm clearly good at explaining things going on. But Pemba, I'd have to explain very clearly why we were doing it this way and how it would cut together. So you were always kind of jumping ahead. Compounded by the fact that we were at 3,500 meters, which is 12,000 feet. And that is high enough to make you just want to go to sleep at any given juncture. You're just like, can I just go to sleep now? You had to be so prepared and on it. And this, the sun was beating down. It was either really hot, or then the wind would come in and it would be freezing.
And when you say really hot, what sort of temperature?
Oh yeah, it'd be like 20, 30 degrees, and when the sun came, when it wasn't windy, at the top of the mountain, you'd be there in t-shirts and shorts. But snow, and then you'd have to be just completely blitzed, because you got the sun above and then the reflected light off the snow. I mean, this is what they told me to climb. One of the most dangerous places to get sunburn when you're climbing a mountain is your upper palate, because when you're climbing a mountain, what are you doing? You're going, so you're meant to breathe through your nose, and what happens is the snow bounces up into your upper palate and burns it, because it's clearly so sensitive, and you get blisters. So you have to learn to keep your mouth shut, or balaclava over it. So you never think of that, do you?
So did you have to do like a huge amount of physical prep yourself before you went? Or
I was so physically fit. No, we did some climbing technique practice then in Glendalough. Just some of the crew. I did it mostly just to get a handle on what it was, how to use the equipment, and just to have a technical proficiency in getting it right. I think if you're going to do something like reconstruction like this, and you've got to get the details right. Having Pemba there was going to ensure that was it. We had the right gear. Everything was identical, and the surface. But physicality, I would stress to people, anyone who wants to shoot on a mountain, get very physically fit, because it's like making any film, you need to be physically fit. It's just such an emotional and physical strain on you anyway. But working at altitude it's even more difficult. It's just everything's really slow, and because we're where you were, just because you're in the Alps doesn't mean, even if you're over a 20-foot drop, that's enough to kill you. Sometimes we were over 500 foot drops, and everyone had to be roped in. So health and safety is so paramount, and moving gear around, and it's just it was hard,
intensive.
But believe me, I'm not bitching about how hard it is to make a film.
No, but it is as it is,
Very much so.
You never met Ger, but in any sense, did you have the feeling that you worked very, very closely with him? And is that strange, having never met somebody?
There was an interview that's used heavily not heavily, but a good bit in the film. That was done by Limerick West. I think I get this wrong every time in my brain. And it was brilliant. It was done it was conducted I think on his last visit home over the Christmas period, and he talked about climbing Everest, and he tried to climb K2 in 2006, and had a serious injury, and talked about that. And he didn't talk about going back at that point. I don't think he knew he was going, or at least if he did, he wasn't saying it was family. But he was so funny and warm and articulate, and such a gentleman and such a gentle soul, and you could tell from listening to him how genuine he really was. And that was really I just felt, between that and there was a clip of an interview that Kevin Hughes had filmed on Everest. He'd gone out to do a documentary for Pat Falvey on Everest in 2003, and Jared talked about rescuing Pat Falvey, and it's a clip in the film where he talks about finding Pat, and Pat was collapsed, and you can see Jared just living the moment and breaking down emotionally. And that to me said more about the kind of person that he was. It's just that he couldn't leave people behind, and that he was he don't get me wrong, he had as much ego and drive to climb a mountain as any of these climbers, but he also had this wonderful empathy with other people. And he was a politician in the respect that he was the diplomat, should I say, maybe more than a politician, a diplomat, where Wilco's rather abrasive character and pissing off the other teams by going, no, you must do it this way, or get out of my way, or don't do this, or you're going to pay to use my ropes. Ger would go around afterwards and say, hey, let's have a cup of tea, and he's a good guy, he's just it's a language thing or something, and he would go around and smooth over all the cracks and make everybody work together and be a really good guy. And I think between that and meeting his family and talking to them and working with them so closely, then they're really a testament to who he was. I think you can always tell a person from the people that they come from, and they are like that, and they're wonderful, warm, caring, loving people. And I really wish I could have met him, but I don't know if I did know him, would I have made this film? I don't know. That's the thing. All you could ever hope for is that what there is a fitting tribute to what I think was one of the world's great human beings, and a true hero.
Okay. So you had invested all of this time and energy, and so when did it become apparent to you that you had created something? Because it was a success. When did that become?
Well, it was honestly, it was a difficult process because it was a 12-month editing process, and people wavered. I'll be honest. We had a nearly finished film, and then the BBC didn't like it.
What didn't they like?
They thought it was, what the hell is this about? It's confusing. It was a rough cut. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So we'd stripped away the. I'd done VO over all the non-English interviews, you know what I mean? So I'd spoken over, so I got rid of that and put the RT subtitles in, which are in the finished film. But we watched it on a tiny screen, and it was just, they missed it, and there was temporary card holders, and there was still green screen in there, and but ostensibly it was the finished film, like the structure of the film as it was now. But they wanted something that was just a little more direct and a little more straightforward and not so circuitous. And the problem,
that's difficult when you have so many perspectives.
But it's almost impossible to tell that story in a linear fashion. And in case I sound defensive, we did obviously investigate, even on paper, Mark and myself initially, the route of moving the film in a linear fashion. But if you started that story and went from beginning to the end, it would be 40 minutes before anything happens. You'd be watching people discussing ropes and talking about things on a mountain that you go, oh. When you see them discussing ropes, the thing is, we play the film from beginning to end in the first act, almost the beginning to the end of the first act. So when we come into the second act, we now know 10 people are dead or missing and whatever, and but it rewinds, and then we go back to investigate. So now, when we see people discussing ropes, pay attention here. You should have been paying attention to this, and all those climbers in that tent should have been paying attention because their lives depended on the discussions and the agreements that were made in a tent that were subsequently not honoured, and that's the problem. So now you get to see that, and it was amazing to have that archive. We had 2 cameras between Ger and Frederick Strang on that. I'd heard about those meetings when Pemba discussed, and that's why I believe Pemba's story, because verbatim he told us what had happened in those, and he hadn't seen the video. And when I saw those videos maybe a year and a half later, it was like stepping through time. It was like stepping back in time, because I was watching something that I've been told about, and this is exactly what he said. So I found that fascinating. I haven't said I've watched the entire things. They're an hour-long meeting, you know what I mean? And it's very difficult to go through it all because the sound isn't so good in certain parts of it. But anyway, we structured it. But they didn't seem to want to do it that way. And I wasn't happy because it took out a lot of the themes of the film. Obsession, about going back again, because we discussed about Ger and Wilco being on K2 in 2006, and what drives you to do that. And they also, biggest difference was it took out the Walter Bonatti story, which I thought was a wonderful parallel, the Italian climber in 1954, which also then deals with the whole theme of the film, which was stories. Everyone has a story. Everybody has a story. And when you strip those things away, I felt the film was just a little TV, okay. Which is fine because it was for the BBC, and that's the so as we focused on delivering that, and then when it was finished, I just turned around to the film board and I said, "You've got to give me 2 more weeks. Just give me 2 more weeks, and let me do like the film I want to make. And I rang up Mark and I rang up Ben Stark, who was the editor in London, who was a brilliant editor, and I said, open up the cut from the 26th of March, which is the one that we had floundered on with the BBC, and and he went, we're going back there, and I went, yeah, we're going back there, and that's what we put together. And you know what, at the time everyone going like, fine, if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do, and that's fine. That's the film that got selected for London, and the film that eventually got selected for Sundance. And whether it's ironic or not, we won for best editing in Sundance. So that sounds terrible and arrogant when I'm saying that, but there's a kind of divine justice in that one, in that, like, well, you know, and the problem is it's very difficult to step away after a year looking at something and know whether it's, you know, is it just me, or am I tired, or have I seen it, or can you see this with fresh eyes? But, you know, it seemed to reach out to people, and people responded to it, and you got a huge reaction in London. And you know, I thank Michael Hayden, who's here now actually, for that, and he saw the film and really responded to it, and I thank Dave Courier in Sundance, who had heard about it because of John Batsek, my UK producer in Passion Pictures. He had heard through John about the film, and he said, hey, any chance I could see it? And I said, yeah. And so I sent it to Sundance, and I couldn't believe when we were in competition, and it was just like, whoa, it's a dream come true, isn't it? I mean, and that was such an eye-opener, going to Sundance and having, you know, lines of people going into the film and people talking about it. And I brought Pemba over to Sundance. He was stopped on the streets by everybody, and they wanted his autograph and pictures with him, and it was so wonderful. And everyone was just going like, I don't know what it did to his ego. He's so egoless, Pemba, in that respect. But it was so wonderful to finally see, you know. I'll tell you what it is. You set out to make a film like this, it's because you want to get a story out there to the widest audience possible. Why else make a documentary about something and you want to get a story out there? I mean, you know, some people say, I made a film, I don't care if people see it, I just wanted to tell the story. I wanted as many people in the world to see it. We couldn't have done it more effectively than that, in that respect. And that I'm so proud of the fact that we managed to get it out there to as many people like that, you know. And you know, that's what we set out to do.
That's what you set out to do, which was my first question that I didn't ask. So that's brilliant that you just answered it.
It probably sounds terribly
no,
arrogant.
it doesn't. But why else make it?
Well, exactly, you know.
So then, just moving on, how have opportunities opened up for you that weren't on account of the summit? Has it given you more of a direction? Has it clarified what you would like to do?
It gave me much more of an appreciation. I mean, I always loved documentaries, but you know, I mean, I never saw myself as a documentary filmmaker. And
did you ever think of making it as a piece of fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. And for about a month after Sundance, I was in talks with studios to do that, but then there was an Everest picture, 2 or 3 pictures I think on Everest. So and you know what? To be quite honest, the way it would have had, the ending could never be the way it is in the film, because it's just too damn sad. It's too tragic. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? And I could not have a film where we have whoever the Jer character is coming out of the mists with a Sherpa over each shoulder. You know what I mean? It would not play true. You know what? No matter what, if they, you know, took the rights of the film, I don't think I would have directed it. I would have gone, I can't go back there, you know. Anyway, but I met with some very, very senior people on that, and it fascinated me, but also scared me in that respect. The reality is, in terms of, strange enough, I think everyone thinks that you're obviously going to be so busy after that, like just about everyone else who worked on the film got more work out of it than, you know. Mark is always busy. Mark is fantastic. Mark had 3 films in Sundance. That Mark Monroe, the writer. He had Sound City and Diane Crystal, which is playing right now, when this as we're recording this, that year in Sundance. And Mark is just the hardest working man in show business. Really, he's brilliant. If there's one collaborator on that movie I could not have done without more than anybody, it's Mark. He was just he lived every step of that alongside us, you know. He's amazing. And but you know, I think people automatically assume that you're really, really busy. But I mean, for the year afterwards, I mean, I did a lot of touring with the film, traveling with the film. The film launched in the United States, and then, so there was a lot of publicity, PR, a lot of festivals and stuff, and that's great, and it's a wonderful thing, but it is also a very dangerous thing to do, because it kind of takes you out of the loop of something for a while, and then you got to step back into it. But in the background, I was setting up other projects. Where I'm starting on another project right now that I'm actually another documentary that I'm producing, which I probably can't talk too much about right now. Heading to the United States on Monday to start on, and also I'm producing a feature film for Billy O'Brien, which is going, hopefully we're just funded now, and we're going to be shooting that in the United States as well in January of next year. That was going on in the background when I was doing this since 2010. Welcome to the world of film financing. So.
I know, yes, and I mean, that was another question, funding, financing, the challenges that involves, and...
Well, it's getting more and more difficult in every aspect. I mean, look, I much prefer being a director. I'm a producer out of necessity. Okay. I'm good at putting people together. I'm not, but I shouldn't underestimate what I've done as a producer. You know what I mean? I produced and directed The Summit, which was a very schizophrenic place to be, because a producer and a director, they don't have to be loggerheads, but it's kind of like the producer and you's going like, you can't afford to do that, and the director's going, oh, but I have to do it. So you're staring yourself in the mirror. As a producer, I think I'd always come down on the side of the director, which probably makes me not a very good producer. But
a popular one, though.
Popular, maybe, hopefully. But it's not a popularity contest, is it? But it's it is. It's more and more difficult, and obviously making documentaries, it's really difficult to raise finance, because nobody you can't pre-sell a documentary unless you're someone like Michael Moore, probably. You know what I mean? And so it's very, very difficult. I had a lot of really wonderful help on the Summit in respect of in the finance. I mean, I got John Batzik involved very early on, which he brought the BBC. RTE were really supportive. The film board were super supportive as well. And in the 481 aspect, John MacDonald was very helpful. If you know John from Fantastic Films. But I mean, I think the original budget was like, you don't know where to start with that, because you don't know what it's going to cost. But it was an expensive enough film to make because of filming in Switzerland, and then the whole archive, and then the whole editing aspect. So it doesn't take a lot to cost a lot. That's the problem. You know what I mean? I mean, it can spiral out of control very, very, very quickly. So you've got to manage that. The project I'm starting on now, hopefully, it's not going to be reconstructions. It'll be archive probably. So, but archive's expensive. You know what I mean? You think, the thing is, at this stage, until you've done your interview, you don't know what you're going to need. It's the same process. It's not like with a film, like with Billy's film, Billy O'Brien's film, where we know what we have. We have a great script, and we know how we're going to do that, and then you got to figure out the elements that fall into place on that. So you can budget for that. The problem with budgeting for that is that everything goes great, but what you would have got 5 million for 4 years ago, you're getting 1 million for now.
Okay, right, okay.
So it's scary.
So, yeah, you've kind of, it's a challenging industry. Like, are there policies that you would like to see introduced that would enable filmmakers? Is there anything you would change?
I don't know if I've ever been... If I'm like qualified enough to even think, you know what I mean? I've been lucky in the aspect that, like, I guess I got support from the film board on the Summit based on the German, which was very well received as a film, and I think they wanted to. What they were really good at was supporting filmmakers they'd already supported as well. Which is like, so the next step in Nick's career. I mean, obviously they probably thought maybe I was going to go straight into drama, which is what I want to do, and the problem with my love of drama, is everything I want to do is probably so ridiculously expensive that it's almost I'm always one film away from the film I want to make next. If that makes any sense. So in the meantime, I've all these other commitments that I promised other people to do that I'm going to fulfill, and hopefully work on. It's just a constant. You're working on so many fronts. But to go back to the point, the film board they were support. I guess. If I remember rightly, in the beginning of this, because we didn't know what it was going to be is ostensibly about, you kind of have a document going, oh, this is this terrible tragedy, and we want to tell this story, and how are we going to do it? They were supportive, and there's always that unknown factor of, well, what is it going to turn out to be? And that's the very nature of documentary filmmaking, I think. Unless you're making a music film, or it's a you know what I mean, there's something that, you know, doesn't really have necessarily have a mystery aspect to it. But they were supportive all the way through it, as were RTE, and they were, you know, I was lucky in that aspect. I was really, really lucky in that we got to make a film. I mean, as I went in, and not to criticise the BBC for their decision, I'm fine with the fact that they wanted something else. That's fine. That's their prerogative for their funding decision. But it wasn't the film I wanted to make, if you know what I mean. It's a good film, the BBC version, but it's not. I don't think it's as good a film, and it wasn't a film that we set out to make. That, you know, that we all sat down and went, how are we going to do this? You know, okay. And that's all in when you do that, you know.
Your biggest influences, film-wise, or?
But that's the thing. I'm incredibly. I mean, I grew up loving very popular cinema, like, you know what I mean. You know, as a kid, I think I was 6 or 7 when I saw Star Wars. Changed my world, like it did for a lot of people who were that age, I guess. You know, it was the first film where I felt I wanted to live in that world, and that's the thing. You know what I mean? Okay. It's kind of, you know what I mean. You wanted to be somebody in that thing. It's like when films can affect you or reach out to you in that respect. Up to that point, I think, you'd seen kids' films or whatever. You know, the landscape was different. What you saw on TV was generally 6 or 10 years old. You know what I mean? It took that long for films to go from screen to, like, I remember James Bond films. The ones you'd have seen in 1976 were probably the ones from 1966. You know, like probably Goldfinger or something. But yeah, films, very, very, very. You know, and obviously when I went to art college, you started seeing a lot more, you know, foreign films and you know, Italian and French cinema and stuff. Always been a big fan of, like, Wages of Fear, you know, the Yves Montand movie. It's you know, just great dramatic cinema. I've just always been interested in stories in that aspect, you know what I mean? And I think, you know, the great storytellers, you know, I mean, it's the reason why The Godfather is such an interest. It's just a great story. It's just so immersive. Films that place you dead center, where you feel like that you've been taken into another world. I'm not even necessarily talking about fantasy, like in Lord of the Rings or you know, films of that ilk so much, but a film like you can transport you to another time or place has, you know, that's what has always fascinated me. And I think the thing as a director, I mean, probably what draws me as a director is if you can, I think we live vicariously. Like The Summit is a very good example. You know, we can hopefully, as an audience, when people are looking at you can live vicariously through the, you know, the film that we made on screen, and it puts you. The whole point, Mark always said, we want to put you in the boots of the climbers. Mm-hmm. As sad as that is, given what it is, not to make it crass or to make it feel like an adventure movie or a thriller in that aspect. It is. The Summit was very much like a horror story. At times, you want to feel that you're there with them, because it plays out to the emotions in you, and hopefully it's not emotionally manipulative in any way. I think
it's how we understand the world in a way.
It is, and that's the thing, and that's why, I mean, you know, we could have made that film with just staying on the person telling the story of how something unfolded, and it is gripping. I mean, I've watched the interview. I mean, I've sat opposite, like we are now, talking to people with my heart in my mouth and feeling, you know, holding back tears when they get to the points when the shit things happen on that mountain. And but at the same time, you know, we were at pains to not be gratuitous with it. We never really show anything, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the what's implied is what's important. But we were very absolutely at pains to make sure that we didn't show anything that didn't happen. And I guess so, this should really come from somebody else saying it rather than me. But I know, because just about every single person, including Marco, saw it only 2 weeks ago in Italy. And he even blogged afterwards that this is this is the truest event of what happened on that mountain. So unless something even more horrific happened on that mountain that they've all been complicit in keeping to themselves, Wilco, everybody, Pemba, they've all said no. This is it. And you know, that's all you could ever set out to do, and to be faithful and truthful and accurate. And you know, I remember being in Sundance and overhearing people talking about it on the bus, because nobody knows who you are there. It's great, and it's you're sitting there and they're kind of like, it's not a real documentary. It's got reconstructions in it. I mean, that's not real. So it's not, how's that? And you just go, and that's great. That's an opinion.
Yeah, no, and it's totally valid.
Yeah.
Because that's what you want. You want to incite a reaction, good or bad. The best and worst advice you've ever received?
Oh, I don't know. First of all, I have a dreadful memory for most things. So, and that's what best advice and worst advice. I really couldn't tell you. I don't know. I don't know. Nobody ever gives me advice. So, but or if they do, maybe I just don't listen. And maybe the best advice is I should listen more.
So if you were to advise your 20-year-old self?
Yes, if you could go back. I probably would have I probably would have knuckled down a little earlier. You know what I mean? Stop kind of coasting on everyone saying, hey, you're going to be great, you're going to be brilliant. You know what I mean? Because one day you wake up and you realize that you're not just going to be brilliant. You have to make yourself brilliant.
But I think that's a natural progression. I think we all wake up like at 26 and you're like, oh, okay.
That's much earlier than me. So
the coasting is necessary to get to that point.
Well, no, there isn't. I think the thing is, there is a danger that you won't live a life beforehand, and I think the more you can get to see of the world and the more life you can live, you've got more experiences to be able to bring to that world. You know what I mean?
And did you travel a lot?
Yeah, I always travelled. You know what I mean? And travel a lot in this film. Actually, that's the thing as well. 10 countries more. We used to joke about it, say more locations than a Bond movie. But I always love traveling. I love going places, but you got to be there with somebody that that you care about to share that experience. I think you know what I mean, and and it's almost so you can kind of come back and you say, hey, we had a great time there, and it's just to see things. And I didn't do the interrailing thing, and I've never been in Asia, and I really want to go to Asia. I'm going to go there hopefully next year. Never been in South America, so I've traveled a lot around the States. And did a lot of road trips across the States in the centre. It's when you leave the two narrow bands of East and West Coast that you get to see the real America, which can be both heartwarming and frightening at the same time.
I've just come back from New York, and like amazing, wonderful, magical place. But Fox News, it was horrifying. It's horrifying to think that this is...
That's what's been spewed out there, yeah.
Some people, this is their only news feed,
That's the thing. It was interesting. I mean, when that MH17 happened, we'd switch between Sky, which I almost ban in the house because I think Sky is just Fox here anyway, but and CNN. And interesting as CNN's reporting of it was far superior to anything on Sky. And that they just had the same thing on Sky on loop, same non-information, whereas CNN had people looking and asking questions and looking into possibly what happened here and that, and it was a lot more balanced. I mean, because it's kind of slipped in recent years, CNN, but it was like I didn't go on to Fox because I think it really is just an extension of the comedy channel, and it's funny, but it's not funny because it's true, and that's the problem.
If it wasn't true, and then if it wasn't true, it wouldn't be funny. Do you see yourself? Is America more of a natural home for you in terms of filmmaking?
It's hard to say. I mean, a lot of the films I want to make, you think like the funding structures will be in place, would be there, but invariably I'm drawn to stories of people in extremes. So whatever that's going to take you, in the world to make those films, that's fine. Neither here nor there in terms of thing, but as a base. I mean, as much as Ireland can be difficult sometimes to live in, it's home.
And it's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
It's stunning. I was back from West Cork, and if money, place, people were no object, and you could make, is there a subject matter that you would just love to do?
Yes. Plenty, actually, yeah. And I've read a couple of books that, you know what I mean. So some would say I'm drawn to difficult material, you know what I mean, in that, it's challenging. But I think, well, what's the point of doing something that's not challenging, And I can't really, I'm always reticent to discuss because, here's the thing. Like generally, when if you're reading something, you'll never be able to get to make it because somebody's got the options on it. I mean, there's a couple of things at the moment that I'm chasing. I'm just waiting for them to become re-available.
Okay.
Because it's just one of those things where there's no point even talking about that, but where it's just a series of things. I just seem to be always find myself chasing material that is going to be inherently difficult for me to get or make. But everything I've ever done, I always said, well, that's never going to happen. But I mean, that's almost a stick to beat me with, to say, well, watch me make it happen.
Okay.
Does that make any sense?
No, it does. Nick Ryan, thank you so much.